There is a fracture inside NATO that almost nobody is describing the way it deserves to be described. Not the kind of fracture that comes from a disagreement over defense budgets, not the familiar friction over who pays their 2%. This one is different. This one involves a 34-kilometer wide waterway in the Persian Gulf, 20% of the world's daily oil supply, and a question that has been building inside the Western alliance for months now. Whose war is this exactly? And who is expected to fight it? On the surface, this looks like a story about naval deployments near Iran. But underneath that story is something that should concern every Canadian, every European, and anyone who believed, even partially, that the alliance that held the post-war order together still operates on the same shared assumptions it was built on. What is actually happening near the Strait of Hormuz right now is not a military story. It is a story about the slow unraveling of a strategic consensus that Western countries have relied on for decades. And the way that unraveling plays out over the next 6 to 12 months will reshape global energy markets, transatlantic alliances, and the economic conditions that Canadians wake up to every single morning. You need to understand this, not the headline version, the real version. If you are not subscribed yet, do it right now and turn on notifications, because what I am about to show you is going to change how you see this entire story and every story that follows it. Here is the version most major news outlets covered. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched a joint military operation against Iran. Nearly 900 strikes in 12 hours. The strikes targeted Iranian missiles, air defenses, military infrastructure, and leadership. Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei was killed in the initial wave. Iran's military command was decapitated. That is what the network showed you. The drone footage, the satellite imagery, Trump at the podium declaring that the Iranian military had been effectively destroyed. The coverage was extraordinary in its scale and speed, and then, within weeks, it narrowed. Because here is what happened next that most coverage missed entirely. Iran could not match the United States on the battlefield. They understood that from the first hour, so they did not try. Instead, on March 4th, 2026, Iran closed the Strait of Hormuz. Not symbolically, physically, using mines, naval vessels, drone swarms, and the credible threat of anti-ship missiles against any tanker attempting the passage. One tugboat sunk, at least 17 merchant ships damaged, 7 of those abandoned, 12 seafarers killed or missing, and the global oil market suddenly facing the largest supply disruption in its recorded history, not through military defeat, but through geography. The major networks covered the Hormuz closure as a military story, as a logistics challenge, as something the United States would solve within days. That is where mainstream coverage stopped. What was actually happening underneath that story is where this gets serious. Mark Carney is not a politician who learned economics as a talking point. He guided Canada through the 2008 financial crisis with more institutional stability than almost any comparable economy achieved in that period. He was then appointed governor of the Bank of England, the first non-British citizen to hold that position in the institution's 300-year history. He spent 13 years as a managing director at Goldman Sachs. His doctorate in economics is from Oxford. This is a man who has sat in rooms where a single misread signal cost billions of dollars, who has negotiated with governments and central banks that held every card in the conversation. Who understands, at a level most politicians never reach, that the most consequential moves are rarely the loudest ones. So when news broke that Canada's Prime Minister was looking at how to cushion the blow for Canadians as oil prices crossed $1.80 a liter at the pump, up from $1.32 a year ago, the framing of that quote is critically important. Cushion the blow is short-term political language, but the man delivering it has been watching something much larger develop in real time. Carney knows what a structural energy shock looks like. He has studied the 1970s. He has sat with central bankers who still describe stagflation as a trauma, not a theory. And what he is watching right now, an unprecedented closure of the world's most important oil transit corridor, oil prices swinging from $80 to $144 and back to $110 within weeks, and a NATO alliance visibly fracturing over whose responsibility this is not a short-term disruption. It is a restructuring event. And the question of what Canada does with that restructuring is the open loop I will come back to. To understand how we got here, you need to go back further than February 28th. The architecture of the current crisis was being assembled quietly for years. Iran's nuclear program was never fully neutralized by the 2015 JCPOA agreement. It was paused and then restarted after the United States withdrew in 2018. By 2026, Iran's uranium enrichment levels had become a point of genuine red line concern in both Washington and Tel Aviv. That was the stated trigger for Operation Epic Fury, the U.S. code name for the joint strikes. But there was a second architecture being built simultaneously inside NATO, and almost nobody was covering it. Starting in 2024, when the European Union launched Operation Aspides in the Red Sea, a naval mission designed to protect shipping from Houthi attacks, the United States began signaling something to its European allies. Not publicly, quietly. The signal was this: the era in which the United States carries the full cost of securing global maritime trade routes is ending. Europe will need to contribute, not just diplomatically, physically. European governments heard that signal. Most of them chose not to act on it. And then the Strait of Hormuz closed. Trump's response was immediate and blunt. He called on NATO allies, on Japan, on South Korea, on China, to send warships and help escort tankers through the strait. He told the Financial Times, directly, that countries who benefit from Gulf oil exports should contribute to securing the route. He warned that failing to support the effort would be, in his words, very bad. And I want you to hear this clearly. Let me be clear, that won't be, and it's never been envisioned to be, a NATO mission. The EU's own foreign ministers meeting in Brussels came out of their session and said there was no appetite for extending European naval operations into the strait while hostilities continued. And yet, by May 2026, NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte was publicly welcoming the deployment of warships by France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Italy, Germany, and the United Kingdom closer to the Middle East, framing it as preparation for a possible operation to unblock the strait once fighting ends. Wait, read that again. Germany said it was not NATO's war, and then German naval assets began positioning toward the region. The UK said it would not be drawn into the wider conflict, and then UK mine-hunting drones already in the region began discussions about active deployment. France and the UK started leading a planning group for a post-ceasefire unblocking operation. The public position and the operational reality began to diverge. That divergence is the story nobody is connecting. Here is what was actually happening at two levels simultaneously while the public debate ran its course. At the surface level, the political theater was operating exactly as it was designed to operate. European leaders delivered statements rejecting NATO involvement. Those statements protected them domestically. They told their publics, "We are not going to war with Iran." And that was true, in the formal Article 5 invocation sense of the word. But at the operational level, something different was unfolding. Individual NATO member states, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Italy, Germany, the United Kingdom, began quietly repositioning naval assets, not as a NATO force, as individual nations who happened to be moving in the same direction. A coalition of the willing, without the name. This distinction matters enormously, because a formal NATO mission requires consensus. It requires article invocation. It creates political liability. It is slow and visible and subject to public debate. A coalition of individual European states operating in the same theater toward the same objective without a NATO banner, that is faster, less visible, and politically deniable at home. Trump understood this instinctively. His public pressure, his threats about NATO's future, his calls to Japan and South Korea and China was designed to create the conditions under which European governments could justify operational movement while maintaining public denial. He was giving them cover, not forcing their hand. The contrast is stark. Trump's approach, loud, blunt, transactional, designed for television. Europe's response, quiet repositioning, operational preparation, coalition building under the radar, designed to last. One of these approaches was built for the news cycle, the other was built for the waterway. And here is the second open loop. Who is actually winning this strategic exchange? Because the answer is not obvious, and it depends entirely on what happens at the Ankara NATO summit on July 7th and 8th. That meeting is now the most consequential gathering of the Western Alliance in years, and almost nobody is treating it that way. Now let me give you the numbers, because the numbers are where the real story lives. The International Energy Agency, in its May 2026 oil market report, described what has happened to global supply as the largest disruption in the history of the oil market. Not the largest since 2008, not the largest since the 1970s, the largest ever recorded. More than 14 million barrels per day of oil, 14 million, are now effectively shut in, stranded, unable to reach markets through the normal channels. Cumulative supply losses since the Hormuz closure already exceed 1 billion barrels. 1 billion. Oil prices peaked at $144 a barrel. At the time of this recording, North Sea dated crude is trading around $110 a barrel. That is roughly 50% above pre-war levels. The EU estimates that gas prices across Europe have risen 70% and oil by 50%, generating an extra 13 billion euros in fossil fuel import costs for European economies. In Canada, retail pump prices had already climbed to $1.80 a liter by early April, compared with $1.32 a liter 1 year earlier. That is a 36% increase for every Canadian who fills a gas tank, every Canadian who heats their home, every Canadian business that moves goods by truck or rail. And analysts at Goldman Sachs have indicated that elevated prices of this scale could persist through 2027. Now let me contextualize that comparison. The 1973 oil crisis, the event that produced a decade of stagflation, reshaped Western industrial policy, and fundamentally altered how democratic governments thought about energy security, was triggered by a supply disruption of roughly 5 to 6 million barrels per day. We are currently at more than double that level, with a disruption that has no clear end date and no negotiated resolution as of this recording. That is why energy analysts like Fareed Fesharaki, Chairman Emeritus of FGE Nexent ECA, warned in late March that a prolonged near closure of Hormuz could push prices to $150 to $200 per barrel. Those numbers have not materialized yet, but the structural conditions that would produce them are still in place. Let me bring this out of the boardrooms and the briefing rooms, because at some point, every geopolitical confrontation of this scale stops being about governments and starts being about people. Consider what this means in Windsor, Ontario. The auto manufacturing sector that anchors that city depends on just-in-time supply chains. Petroleum-based inputs, rubber compounds, logistics networks running on diesel, all of them have absorbed cost increases that manufacturers are only beginning to pass through to buyers. The workers on those lines are not thinking about NATO's mandate. They are thinking about whether the factory will slow its shifts if global demand softens in response to an energy-driven recession. Consider what this means in Saskatchewan. Grain farmers planting spring crops face fertilizer costs that are directly indexed to natural gas prices, and natural gas prices have Saskatchewan are absorbing a cost shock that originated 12,000 kilometers away in a 34-kilometer strait. Consider what this means in Alberta. Here is the counterintuitive layer that almost nobody is discussing. For Canadian oil producers, elevated global oil prices are, in the short term, a financial windfall. Alberta's oil sands producers are price takers in a market that has just moved significantly in their favor. The Globe and Mail editorial board has already called on Carney to lead a new global energy security pact, one that would bring European and Asian investment into Canadian energy infrastructure in exchange for long-term assured supply commitments. And this is where the first open loop closes. Carney is not simply trying to cushion the blow of an oil shock. He is watching a once-in-a-generation moment in which Canada's strategic value as a stable, democratic, reliable energy supplier has increased dramatically, at the exact moment when the Middle East's reliability as a supplier has been thrown into profound uncertainty. The question is not whether Canada can benefit from this moment. The question is whether Canada moves fast enough and strategically enough to lock in those benefits before the crisis resolves and the window closes. 3 scenarios are now structurally in play. I am not telling you which one will happen. I am showing you what the incentives support. Scenario 1. Managed resolution. The Pakistan-mediated Islamabad talks, which have been the primary diplomatic channel throughout this conflict, produce a framework agreement before the July NATO summit. Iran agrees to Hormuz reopening in exchange for an end to the U.S. naval blockade. Oil prices fall toward $80 to $85 per barrel. The NATO fracture gets papered over with a communiqué about the importance of allied solidarity. Individual European deployments are quietly stood down. Canada's energy opportunity partially closes as the urgency dissipates. This scenario requires both the United States and Iran to accept terms neither side has yet publicly accepted. Scenario 2. Prolonged friction. The Ankara summit passes without a formal NATO mission, but with a quiet operational consensus among willing European states. The EU extends Operation Aspides toward the Persian Gulf. The U.S. naval blockade of Iran continues, with vessels being seized on both sides. Oil prices stabilize in the $100 to $115 range, high enough to maintain economic pressure globally, not high enough to trigger immediate political collapse in any Western capital. The Hormuz crisis becomes normalized, a long-duration energy shock that reshapes industrial policy, accelerates energy diversification, and permanently revalues Canadian oil and gas assets. This is the scenario the market currently appears to be pricing. Scenario 3. Structural decoupling. The July summit fails to produce even quiet consensus. Trump publicly declares that the NATO alliance is no longer fit for purpose in the current threat environment. A formal U.S.-led coalition, distinct from NATO, emerges to manage Hormuz and Persian Gulf security. European states are forced to choose: join the U.S. coalition explicitly, build a purely European security architecture, or accept irrelevance in the conversation about who controls the world's energy arteries. This scenario would not just reshape the Hormuz crisis, it would reshape the entire post-war security order. 3 questions that nobody has answered yet, and that will determine which of those scenarios actually plays out. 1. Will the European states currently repositioning naval assets toward the Gulf commit to active escort operations before a ceasefire? And if they do, what legal and political framework will they operate under? Because the difference between mine-hunting drones and active naval escort missions is not a tactical difference. It is a political declaration about whose war this is. 2. What is Mark Carney's actual timeline for converting Canada's strategic energy opportunity into binding long-term agreements? The Globe and Mail's call for a global energy security pact is an editorial position. Turning it into signed agreements requires a diplomatic offensive that competes with every other priority on a government's plate. How fast can that move? And does Carney have the political capital domestically to move at the speed the moment requires? 3. What happens inside Iran? Mojtaba Khamenei has succeeded his father as supreme leader, but the transition to new Iranian leadership, following the assassination of over 40 senior officials, is not a settled question. A new leadership configuration in Tehran could either accelerate a deal or harden into a more extreme posture that makes any deal impossible for years. Nobody knows which direction that goes, and that uncertainty is the wild card that makes every other scenario conditional. I do not know. Nobody knows yet. Remember the moment this story supposedly began? A viral social media post asking whether NATO forces were moving toward the Strait of Hormuz? Hundreds of thousands of views, intense debate, commentators urging caution because social media reports often emerge before official confirmation. By the time France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Italy, Germany, and the United Kingdom had quietly positioned naval assets in the region, welcomed publicly by NATO's Secretary General, that viral question had already been answered. Not by a press conference, not by a formal Article 5 invocation, by the movement of ships. The official story was, this is not NATO's war. The operational reality was, the ships were moving anyway. That is what a fracturing alliance looks like when it is trying not to fracture visibly. It does not break in a press conference. It bends quietly in the direction of necessity, while the public statements remain unchanged. And the country watching all of this from the outside, sitting on the world's 3rd largest proven oil reserves, governed by a man who spent his career understanding exactly how institutional credibility is built and lost, is Canada. The Strait of Hormuz did not just close a shipping lane, it opened a question that Western democracies have been avoiding for decades. What does collective security actually mean when the costs of maintaining it become real? That question does not have an answer yet, but the ships are already moving. Subscribe, turn on notifications, because this story is not over. It is not close to over. The Ankara summit is weeks away. The Islamabad talks are ongoing.